So today's presentation will be from Chris Fitzpatrick for the University of Paris-Saclay, and he's going to talk about this paper that he and Eric put out earlier last month, about a month ago, 3 weeks ago. So it's a pretty nice, exciting paper. I think you guys will be interested in just hearing about what it's all about. But that's after my quick update. Oh, I always bring up the meetings. Trying to plan an in-person meeting for all of us, but we'll go over that. Let's just skip over that because I'm not sure if it's going to happen or so. But just the papers. There's one new paper that I forgot to mention 2 weeks ago because last week we didn't have our meeting. But this paper came out, this iScience paper, in November. Well, it was preprint was out earlier, but earlier this month. So this is a nice little paper that Rob Miller led, talking about. How looking at the Mason, Chris Mason did it that we're all familiar with. He basically looked at the PCR classified negative patient population and related it back to the RNA-seq data, where the RNA-seq data you could see where the actual virus is present or not. And he realized that some of this classification of PCR negative, those people who are classified PCR negative, some of them did have a phenotype and they were actually positive if you look at the sequencing data. So it's a nice little paper about that and the host response around that.
Afshin, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
What was the percentage of negative patients that actually were apparently positive?
I should know that number. It's in the paper.
Okay, I'll look it up.
I forgot the number. I don't know if Rob's
very...
here. I think Rob's on the study section or something. I think, right? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I should know that number. It's in the paper somewhere. Sorry.
I'll look it up. Thank
you. Yeah. Or I could look that up and tell you after. Yeah, but that's a good question. I should have that ready on top of my head for the next time. But yeah, some just updates, quick updates, as you guys know. Al has his monkeypox groups and it's still around, but hasn't really taken up. The monkeypox hasn't taken up, but it's still around. So people are wanting to look at that. There's some people interested in that. There's case studies that I mentioned that Al's working on. Some of you already mentioned you're going to be helping him out. I'm working on this. Some interesting. I sent out an email about the summary of the case studies to everyone in the group, so people have responded to that. And then we have our YouTube channel, which people we post this just the COVID updates every week, not the presentations. All right, so let's just dive into it. So I'm going to give enough time for Chris to talk, since they've been gone last week. But there's some recent news, COVID news that as we all know, all the predictions that were given of BQ.1.1 about a month ago have come true. About that's going to take over BQ.5 right now, saying 45.
Reporting is on.
44% of the cases, new cases, are actually BQ.1.1, and it was predicted like a month ago from a lot of the virologists that and the computational folks that BQ.1.1 will be dominant by January. And again, this would be since in the U.S. we have our holiday coming up, this is more relevant now because BQ.1.1 has been shown to be very immune evasive and reduced efficacy again once more of the vaccines and so on. So, there's a nice CNN article. This is kind of a no-brainer for, I think, most people who are working on it, but the majority of the public who've given up all mandates and protocols to actually be safe around, this is kind of a reminder, I guess, for them. And then this is an article by the WHO saying globally, weekly cases have increased first time globally in the first 4 months. This was an interesting little article and paper from MIT. They are looking at finding if there's a perfect indoor humidity or indoor climate, basically environment that to curb COVID spread. So they actually found that there is, by looking at different regions of the world, like from the south to the north, and then different humidity, different outdoor temperatures, and then figure out correlating that to, for example, increased death rates or increased cases. And then they said, indeed, there was actually maybe an indoor relative humidity of 40-60% is associated with lower COVID infections and deaths, based on all their computational studies that are relating with environmental data and COVID data. So it's interesting little read. But so in case you wanted to keep your house at an optimal temperature during holidays or humidity, you might want to keep it during this to reduce. It doesn't say it doesn't get rid of it, but this reduces it. So that was interesting. I always like to look at Eric Topol. He does, I think his blog is really nice. That he constantly updates. I don't know how he has time to do it, but it's a very nice service he provides. This is actually one. Oh, sorry, let me jump to the first news article here about the triple demic. As we know, triple threat, influenza, RSV, and COVID-19. As we know, is they're all pretty dominant in causing a lot of infections. If it's not COVID, it's this RSV virus. If it's not RSV, it's influenza. So people are just warning about that. So Eric Toppel's blog has a few posts on there I'm going to go over. One of them is this one. He has some new booster data that Moderna had put out in some papers talking about the efficacy and the effectiveness of the new booster from Moderna versus Pfizer. They're basically both providing beneficial effects for that bivalent booster. That's the short answer for that. But also, there's a bunch of new variants that popped up. This is a little complicated thing. It was originally created by this guy, Daniel Fucasi. And it's a nice little diagram of the complexity of Omicron and how many variants have popped up. And we're right here in this lower right panel, BQ.1.1 is here. And as you can see already, there's a plethora of new variants that have popped up from BQ.1.1. So that's concerning to see. But the good thing is only BQ.1.1 is the dominant one, and these other ones might probably be outcompeted out. That's what the theory is, But there's several ones like BE.9 that's in South America, starting in the Amazon region, starting to come in. These other ones, so I guess people should just see what they are and what happens with them. They might just peter out, as we've seen a lot of these variants do. So then also Paxlovid resistance and things like that has been in the news, and over the past few. Or Paxlovid being beneficial for long COVID. That's been in the news also, which I'm going to go into in a few slides down. But this one, Eric Toppel thing, these papers that came out just recently, for example, this Nature paper was interesting, talking about, and these experiments are done in the lab. So they're not seen evolutionary in the patients or clinically, but they force these things. So this one here, paper talking about multiple pathways, clinically driven if the SARS-CoV-2 could increase the resistance to Paxlovid, how it can be done, but it was in a lab-induced resistance. Let's put it that way. And there's another study that Eric talked about where, like, for example, this site here can have 100-fold resistance, again, in the lab, not clinical. So this is potential ways, like, these articles and him talking about in this blog, how, potential ways if the virus can, in the clinic, form resistance. It hasn't yet. Some people say it has for some versions of the previous strains. I think had some indications to have Paxlovid resistance, like BQ.1.1 seems to be somewhat resistant to monoclonal therapy and things like that. But whether Paxlovid resistance, I think, is still up in the air. But it has a potential to. And then this was just this kind of one of those no-brainer studies where I think it's important to get out again because people have lifting all mask protocols, and Eric Toppel talks about it in his protocol. In his blog here. But it's a nice, basically, proof of principle. Again, this dotted line, is where, this is a Massachusetts study in schools where mask mandates were lifted in Massachusetts, and pretty obvious to us, but I think maybe the public might not, has to be reminded about it again, where obviously this is where the weekly cases before mask mandates were lifted, and now dotted line, you can see the increased student staffs, doesn't matter. People stop wearing their masks. Again, I think it's probably better for the public. I mean, everyone here probably already is aware of that, and the numbers changing. So again, I'm trying to go through this quick so I can give time for Chris to talk in the next 5 minutes. So some recent long COVID news. Steve thanks for emailing this earlier this morning, but Steve had emailed this to some of us in the morning about, brought attention about this next news article.
I'm trying to hear.
Oh, can you please mute if you're not muted? Yes. So this is about talking about just kind of the millions of long non-COVID and more that things to come, as the title says, and talking about kind of summarizing some papers, which was this newer paper in September came out summarizing the epidemiology of long COVID, what's happening there, and then also talking about some other papers I think I brought up in the past meetings. But the overall summary is that 7% of these studies that people have done, whether it's through the CDC or these papers, said they have long COVID. It's approximately 18.5 million people. I think there's some microphone out somewhere. I have to mute. Okay, so then, and then also, and I'm sure people who read, Steve sent this to, I'm talking about how many people are impacted. So, it's basically talking about the impact of long COVID and bringing the reality of it to the public saying, it's really important to consider. I didn't know about this last bullet about the age, how this census bureau said 40, 49 are more likely to get long COVID. That's an interesting little tidbit from this article that I learned about. We knew about the women almost twice as likely because there's been plenty of papers coming out showing that. More long COVID news about Eric Koppel actually summarizes some nice newer studies done. This one study done by the Veteran Affairs talking about reinfections and how this might apply to long COVID. So there's a Veterans Affairs one talking about reinfections, and the key points from that study, which is here, this Nature Medicine study, and how this impacts long COVID. Basically, they noticed from this study is like there's a dose that basically the more times you get infected, it accumulates worse and worse, and the organ effects are worse and worse. They have some data they showed in that paper there that showed that. Also, the acute phase, as this is, while much of the adverse outcomes was in acute, you can see that persistently, the more times you get sick, the worse it is in the organs, and the more deaths and hospitalizations that may occur after, 6 months later. And this was an interesting fact from this paper too, that vaccination status had no substantial protective event for people getting a reinfection. So the percentage was the same. And of course, he points out ways to avoid it, not getting COVID, obviously, 100% effective, but getting vaccinated does have been shown to maybe provide 30 to 50% protectiveness against long COVID. And a lot of the more recent studies, so that was a number that I wasn't aware of yet. If that was more all over the place, but it seems to be more defined now. And then the Paxlovid, which I'm going to get into in a second, he has another blog talking about this, but has a chance to reduce long COVID by this larger VA study, which you'll see in the next slide. There's also this study here, German study, talking about the impact of long COVID in children and adults, and it's pretty, I think it's a really nice, large study they did. And one of the first ones, I think they started looking at the children aspect of long COVID and defining it, which is interesting to see. It's talking about long-term impact, meaning the ICU's hospitalization after you get COVID. And then this next slide is now talking about Paxlovid and long COVID. And this top blog here, these papers that came out, this is preprint that come out. Again, with preprints, you probably need to take it with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting data here where they showed reduced severity, so reduced impact of long COVID on health and death and survival, because we know long COVID can lead to potential hospitalization and things like that once your virus is gone. But this is just one of the plots of this. But basically, the bullet points are, that's further reduction of deaths from this preprint, which is nice to see, and it represents a 48% reduction of death, 30% reduction of hospitals after the acute phase, which is nice. So, and the basic idea is, no difference with sex and the age. There's some benefits with certain age groups over others, but it doesn't matter. The benefits are still overall the same with all age groups. So that was a nice study to see. And then this also leads to one of his other blogs talking about Paxlovid rebound, which we know is in the news. And he had a colleague, and I think hopefully this will come out in the study soon, but I guess people from Scripps had done this study looking at viral rebound. And the numbers we hear in the public basically is a lot, public perception seems to be a lot higher for rebounds than the actual case. And this is probably one of the first non-published data, I guess it is. Hopefully they'll publish this data, but showing that indeed, Paxlovid rebound is really anywhere from 5 to 12% viral testing rebounds, as they show here. But so it's lower than public perception is. And the benefits of it, as we see, is far outweighs the chance of rebound. That's an interesting, if you could read more about it in his blog too. Again, I'm going through this quick to give Eric a chance to talk. So this Paxlovid, not Paxlovid, the long COVID dashboard is still there. Some of the cases, as we know, BQ.1, you see it's starting to take over everywhere. The wastewater is kind of showing kind of a steady plateau here. It was going down, but it's a steady plateau. But certain regions, for example, where I'm at, and around the Boston, Middlesex County, there is a dip down, so maybe that's good news. But as people are predicting, this might be false security here because with the holidays coming and BQ.1 quickly taking over everything, this might be a peak coming soon from BQ.1.1. And this leads to, the cases in the U.S., you can see how quickly BQ.1 is rising everywhere, taking over. As you see here, it's falling very closely to trend of BA.5 was, a while back. And then globally, this is same trends. There's some things happening in Germany where BQ.1, the one first reared its ugly head. It's actually the number of cases and hospitalizations have gone down, which is good to see. France, since Chris is from and Erica France have been presenting, showing this data, shows that again they're going down for new case and hospitalizations. That's good, but it's predicted that BQ.1.1 is actually dominant. And please mute your mics. So, and then the UK is not seeming to, again, following the rest of Europe trends, but people are thinking BQ.1.1 taking over US. We talked about this as a plateau, which might be leading to more cases. But if we follow US trends, Brazil still plateau, but there seems to be a little upturn here, but we'll have to wait and see what that happens. South America. Japan and other Asian countries are interesting because this was BQ.5, or not BQ.5, BA.5, sorry. And then they had this large peak down, but then all of a sudden you see this rise again. So whether that's because of introduction of one of the new variants, I don't know. In South Korea, same thing. So that's some interesting trends there. In South Africa, it's pretty steady. Maybe I'll just show those things. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly go through that. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Sorry, probably to avoid.